Adar can testify to how many very far right-wing Israelis attack me just because I agree that there is a Palestinian identity, a Palestinian experience, a Palestinian need, and that there a real human population here that must live here with us and find. Just because I have these humanistic, universalistic values, then I'm automatically rejected by a lot of people that are in the far extremes. And I think these far extremes are really built and grow out of trauma that they kind of oppose one another. And I must be against the other side in order for me to survive because that's my enemy. And the way to transcend that is to no longer see them as the enemy. But I do want to touch on, let's say, for example, the African American, Black community, people of color, whatever someone chooses to identify within the United States. And we see the shift within pop culture when it comes to how that community is perceived within the US. And there's definitely still systematic racism within the US, but let's look at pop culture, right? If you go 70, 80, 90 years ago within the US, the culture was very racist, and most people had racist ideas. And even if you had no racist idea, an individual saying something racist would get away with it because that was just the norm. Today, in intellectual spaces on college campuses, if you say something racist, you're ostracized, and that's normal. If you say something sexist, you're ostracized, and that's normal. You say things against a minority community, that's normal. So there's been a shift within the pop culture amongst the younger generation, and there's still a lot more work to do, but it is possible. So I think it is also very possible between Israelis and Palestinians. And you look at other countries that fought wars for hundreds of years, like France and Germany. Today they don't relate to that anymore. It's been so long, and they've been able to move forward. And they are living in a totally different movie than their ancestors were living in. So I do think we need to create a new movie. In my experiences at Columbia University, when I opened the student group that was fighting for Jewish rights in Israel and educating, we also added another element that really exposed those that were anti-Israel and not pro-Palestinian. And again, the reason I call these groups that were on campus claiming to be pro-Palestinian is because they never talked about Palestinian suffering when it came out of the context of Israel. They manipulated certain things. For example, 3 weeks ago, we had a Palestinian individual, again, this represents this individual, not the collective, that drove a car into a bunch of IDF soldiers. And the IDF soldiers shot him and he was killed. And everyone was talking about how IDF soldiers are killing Palestinians because of this example. And it's taking the context out of it. This is if you don't want to call him a terrorist and you want to call this individual militant against another army force, Sababa, you can say that. But this is war. This is fighting. This is not a deliberate attempt to go and kill a Palestinian because he's Palestinian. So are there times where this has happened? Yes, and they must be condemned. But when we conflate issues, we manipulate issues, and we use them to kind of demonize and remove the humanity of the other side, I think that creates a lot of negativity and fuels the conflict that exists. So what we did on college campuses in order to change this narrative of if you're pro-Palestinian, it means you must be anti-Israel, and if you're pro-Israel, it means you must be anti-Palestinian, is we started to bring conversations similar to the ones that we're having now that were titled Beyond Common Narratives. One of our first ones that we did is we brought a Palestinian individual who, at the age of 15, stabbed an IDF soldier, sat 15 years in an Israeli prison, learned English, learned Hebrew, learned about nonviolent movements like what Gandhi did to the British Empire, and eventually joined an organization in Israel called Combatants for Peace. And for him, he's still very much so anti-Israeli government policies and anti the IDF. And he's not a tokenized Palestinian that speaks only on behalf of Israel, which unfortunately those exist on both sides. But he's a true activist for Palestinian rights, but no longer sees the path for us to live together as war and demonization of each other. And we brought a Jew living in Judea and Samaria together. So naturally, to the campus, they're supposed to be opposed to one another. So they're supposed to be against one another. But in reality, even though they disagreed on some issues like me and you disagree now, on the majority of how to move forward and to conceptualize our identities and to be able to understand and move forward, they agreed. And this shocked the campus because they didn't know that something like this can exist. So I think
Mm.
if we want to shift pop culture, we have to provide something better. We have to provide something that actually works for both. For example, BDS resolutions, right? A lot of people that support BDS resolutions, although they're horrible, they feel like this is the only thing that exists that I can support to help Palestinians, which I truly want to do. So, what if Israelis and Palestinians were able to create solutions and resolutions on a college campus to divest from certain companies that profit from both of our conflicts and both of our suffering, to be against the US foreign aid to Israel, which profits from this conflict, to fight against the characters of our story that are actually profiting from us suffering, and to invest in the humanization of both populations, to invest in the understanding of both of our sufferings, to invest in the future of our populations. If we offer something better, I think naturally that would be put aside. And I think there will always be individuals that are hateful. There will always be individuals that are racist, that are sexist, that are anti Semitic, that are Islamophobic, that are anti Arab, that are anti all sorts of populations. But they have to be kept in the shadows. They have to feel that if they air out their opinions, that they will be socially ostracized. Because I do believe in freedom of speech. But I also believe in the consequences of freedom of speech, which is social reaction to that speech. Someone no longer wanting to be associated or friends with an individual that has such horrible views. That's also freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And we need to create a reality where if someone says something against Palestinians or someone says something against Israelis, that they are ostracized by both of our communities. And I think the best way to do that is start to humanize each other, understand our experiences, our identities, and focus on how do we move forward from here. Because at the end of the day, everyone thinks that they're a good guy. Everyone supporting, Palestinian rights think they're doing things to support Palestinian rights. Everyone thinking supporting Jewish rights in Israel are thinking they're doing things to support, Israel and the good cause. But we need to realize that both of our movements are fundamentally intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no success of either movement without the success of both movements together. And the real conversation is how to transcend this conflict and be able to build that reality for our kids to live in.